Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the dusty curtains of history to peek into something pretty fundamental to the human experience, especially for about half of us on this planet: anxiety. You picture it sometimes, right? That buzzing hum in your head, the frantic loop of worries, the knot tightening in your stomach. Imagine feeling that, but instead of getting a gentle nudge toward mindfulness, or maybe a slightly questionable herbal tea from the local organic shop, history had some truly wild ideas about what was happening inside your head, like you probably wouldn't survive their diagnostic process. Let's just put it that way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing where in the world you're listening from, maybe your local time too, that always feels pretty cozy knowing we're drifting off together across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the hot, dusty corridors of ancient Egypt, the air thick with the smell of spices, Nile water, and something else. Maybe a hint of frustration mixed with despair. You hear whispers, tales of women afflicted by a strange malaise, erratic moods, unexplained physical symptoms, a restless unhappiness that doctors of the time found utterly baffling. They had a theory, though a beautifully anatomical one. The uterus, this powerful, sometimes unpredictable organ, was wandering. Yes, wandering, like a confused little road trip through the internal landscape, bumping into other organs and causing chaos. This, in their view, explained everything from suffocation and paralysis to, well, you guessed it, anxiety and other emotional disturbances. They even had texts like the Cahun Gynecological Papyrus from around 1825 BCE, outlining symptoms and treatments related to this wandering womb idea. It's one of the earliest medical documents showing this belief. That's your mainstream historical fact for the section, by the way. So next time you feel a bit frazzled, maybe your appendix just needs a little push. Just kidding. Mostly. Think about it. Your internal organs are just free-roaming nomads seeking better real estate. Imagine the conversation with your doctor. Well, I'm feeling anxious, can't sleep, getting heart palpitations. The doctor nods, sagely taps a papyrus roll. Ah, yes. Clearly your womb is attempting to unionize and demand higher wages elsewhere. We need to coax it back home. How exactly do you coax a rebellious organ back into place? With smells, of course, foul smells applied near the nose or mouth to drive the errant organ downward toward its proper place, and sweet smells applied near the, well, let's just say other end to entice it back. Yes, you heard that right. We're talking burnt animal hides, rotten meat, anything unpleasant up top, fragrant oils, incense, sweet substances down below. The ancient Egyptian version of aromatherapy, only way more gag-inducing. That's our quirky fringe tidbit right there, the olfactory uterus wrangling. You have to wonder if the treatment caused more anxiety than it cured. Smells awful. Is that my uterus? Moving west, centuries later, you find yourself lounging toga-clad in the shade of an olive tree in ancient Greece. The Egyptians had their wandering wombs, but the Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and later Galen, though technically Roman, he built on Greek ideas, expanded the concept into a grand theory of the human body based on 4 fundamental substances: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were the humors: your temperament, your health, your very personality. Everything was a delicate balance of these 4 guys. Anxiety or conditions related to it like melancholia, too much black bile or excessive agitation, maybe too much yellow bile, wasn't necessarily the womb playing musical chairs internally anymore, though the term hysteria itself stuck around and became inextricably linked to women's anxiety-like symptoms deriving from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. So the uterus still gets top billing in the diagnostic confusion. It's like the scapegoat organ of ancient medicine. According to this humoral theory, imbalances were corrected through dietary changes, lifestyle adjustments, purges, yes, making you expel stuff either through vomiting or the other end or bloodletting. Feeling agitated? Perhaps you have too much hot, dry yellow bile. Let's bleed you to cool you down. Feeling melancholic? Too much cold, dry black bile. Maybe you need warmer foods and environments. It all sounds a bit complicated to track, doesn't it? Okay, I just sneezed. Did that use up too much phlegm? Is my black bile on the rise now? Quick, somebody get me a warm sponge bath. The sheer mental load of keeping track of your humoral balance probably induced its own form of anxiety. Historians still argue whether the ancient Greek understanding of hysteria was purely anatomical, like the Egyptians, or whether they were starting to see some conditions as arising more broadly from women's physiological differences and societal roles. Were they diagnosing actual anxiety or a cluster of socially unacceptable behaviors or physical symptoms in women? It's debated largely because the ancient texts can be interpreted in different ways. And let's be honest, the lines between physical, emotional, and spiritual health were way blurrier back then than our modern segmented medical model likes them to be. Did you have a problem with your humors, a possessed organ, or were you just really stressed out about goat herding and inconvenient togas? The records aren't exactly crystal clear on that. This humoral system, especially through the lens of Galen, became the dominant medical paradigm across Europe and the Middle East for over 1,000 years. Imagine having the same basic diagnostic framework for 15 centuries. You'd think someone somewhere would be like, maybe it's not always about the phlegm, but nope. It had serious staying power. So if you were a woman in these eras feeling that familiar knot of dread or experiencing unexplained physical symptoms, you were entering a medical system that had predefined explanations ready and waiting, often involving your reproductive organs or your bodily fluids being just terribly out of sync. It's a rather stark contrast to how we view mental distress today, trading wandering organs for misfiring synapses and humoral imbalance for neurochemical ones. Though if you spill your coffee and feel like your day is ruined, maybe that is a modern take on a humoral imbalance. Too much bitter brew, too little sugary calm. Okay, probably not the same thing. Definitely smells better than burnt animal hides, though. That's a win. You can almost smell the frankincense and sweat mixing with questionable medicinal odors. This era wasn't just about anatomical weirdness. It was about integrating physical symptoms with the available understanding of the body and the prevailing cultural beliefs about women. Their reproductive systems were seen as inherently unstable, more prone to disruptions that could then cascade throughout the body, affecting the mind. It wasn't a malicious theory, necessarily just born of limited anatomical knowledge and observation through a distinctly gendered lens. And maybe, just maybe, some doctors were trying their best with the tools they had, which sometimes included stuffing sweet-smelling things into places that probably weren't designed for it. They were winging it a bit, bless their misguided hearts. The sands of time shift and you find yourself stumbling through a dim, cool stone monastery somewhere in the Middle Ages. The air smells of damp stone beeswax, candles, and, well, less pleasant things depending on whose stable you're near. The vast empire that clung to humoral theory for so long has crumbled, but the ideas didn't disappear entirely. Oh no. Instead, they got bundled up with a new dominant force, Christianity. Suddenly, that knot in your stomach, that frantic fear, wasn't just about too much black bile sloshing around. It could also be a sign of sin, perhaps a punishment for transgression. Or worse, a sign that something external, something spiritual had gained a foothold. We're talking demons. Yes, those guys. In the medieval mindset, the boundary between the physical body, the mind, and the soul was exceptionally permeable. If you felt unwell mentally or physically, it could very easily be attributed to supernatural forces. A particularly persistent form of anxiety, deep melancholia, or sudden fits of distress might not lead a physician to prescribe only bloodletting or a purge anymore. Now they might involve the clergy. Exorcism wasn't just for spinning heads and green vomit, though they had theories about that too. It was also for chasing out the internal demons causing tormenting thoughts, irrational fears, or a general state of dis-ease. That fusion of the medical or proto-medical with the spiritual is a mainstream historical fact of this era. Distress became something that required confession, prayer, possibly pilgrimage, alongside whatever physical remedies the still present humoral doctors might suggest. It was a comprehensive, if sometimes terrifying, treatment plan. Okay, first 10 Hail Marys. Then, let's talk about that leech's appointment. But let's be honest, chasing demons out with holy water sounds intense. For less extreme cases of anxiety or persistent worry, things they might label as melancholy or nervousness, but filtered through their understanding, the treatments leaned more into a mix of faith folk practice and those lingering humoral concepts. You still had your bleeding and purging because, hey, worked for the Romans, allegedly, right? But you also had an extensive pharmacopoeia based on herbs often used in ways that now sound imaginative, to put it kindly. Forget sniffing lovely essential oils. Medieval remedies for things akin to anxiety could include drinking concoctions featuring unpleasant ingredients like animal dung or ashes mixed with potent herbs like hellebore. Highly toxic. Side note: barrage said to bring courage, or valerian still used for relaxation today, minus the dung. You might wear amulets engraved with protective symbols, sleep with certain plants under your pillow, or recite specific prayers or charms tied to alleviating distress. It's like extreme holistic wellness with a heavy dose of don't get too cozy with Satan. Here's a wonderfully quirky tidbit. There was a belief that certain herbs were particularly effective because their properties aligned with the perceived nature of the ailment, or even the specific demon causing it. Take wormwood, for example. Bitter bracing. It was often used for stomach issues, but also for things related to nervousness or melancholia, perhaps due to its association with cleansing and expulsion, chasing out the bitter humors or spiritual influences causing distress. And some of these concoctions weren't just drunk. They were applied as poultices inhaled, or even, well, you don't want to know where else some were applied. The ingredient list reads like a challenge for a medieval survival cooking show. All right, competitors, today's challenge: make a calming tea using only slug slime, ground bone, and whatever herb the local wise woman says smells like despair. Bonus points if you don't immediately contract a fever. It really makes modern medicine's suggestion of try breathing exercises feel positively spa-like. So you're feeling a sense of impending doom. Your physician, who is also probably a part-time monk, looks you over. Is it too much black bile causing those cold, heavy feelings? Or did you harbor a sinful thought that invited a minor demon of despair to perch on your shoulder? The answer might be a combination. Maybe the humoral imbalance made you more susceptible to demonic influence, or vice versa. The diagnosis often depended heavily on the practitioner's leaning. Were they more medical or more clerical? And if your symptoms were particularly unusual or violent, you might be sent straight to the church for spiritual intervention, which, depending on the local priest's interpretation of scripture and personal patience levels, could range from simple prayer to theatrical exorcism rituals involving shouting restraint and lots of Latin. Imagine dealing with social anxiety while someone loudly screams ancient exorcism rites at you. Father, I just wanted to order a beer, not battle Beelzebub. Historians still argue whether accounts of demonic possession or spiritual affliction in the Middle Ages describe what we would today recognize as severe mental illnesses, like psychosis or certain forms of anxiety/depression, or whether they were genuinely reporting experiences understood through the lens of demonology and faith. It's tough to disentangle because people believed so strongly in these forces and their experiences, and reported symptoms would be shaped by that belief. Was the person having a panic attack interpreting their racing heart as a demon's frantic clawing at their chest? Or was the belief system itself causing a distinct, non-modern phenomenon? We don't have brain scans of medieval patients, just fragmented records colored by the worldview of the time. Life was hard back then, too. Famine, disease, violence, genuine threats were constant. Anxiety wasn't exactly a luxury they could afford to ponder deeply from a purely psychological standpoint. When bad things happened inside or outside the body, explanations were sought in the spiritual or the broadly physical via humors. The idea of a purely internal psychological process leading to persistent distress was much less common than seeing it as an attack from without, demons, witchcraft, divine wrath, or a breakdown of the physical humoral self. It was a system that provided answers, however unsettling, in a world that felt unpredictable and often terrifying. You might be terrified of the prescribed treatment, which feels like an extra layer of anxiety on top of your initial distress. Is this herbal sludge supposed to cure me or just distract the demon with its terrible taste? Honestly, might do both, and probably give you indigestion for a complete humoral reset experience. So less talk therapy, more pray hard, purge harder, and avoid suspicious-looking plant pastes. A very specific vibe, I'd say. You step out of the dimly lit medieval cloister and blink into the dazzling light of the Renaissance, roughly spanning the 14th to 17th centuries. Cities are growing, universities are flourishing. Anatomy studies are making cautious progress, often thanks to less cautious grave robbing, but let's not dwell. You feel the intellectual ferment in the air, a renewed interest in classical texts, including those old Greek and Roman medical writers like Hippocrates and Galen. And what comes surging back alongside artistic masterpieces and scientific inquiry, humoral theory, That's right, it didn't quite die out in the Middle Ages, it just got dressed up in slightly fancier clothes. So if you're a woman feeling anxious or exhibiting what might be considered symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder today, restlessness, irritability, chronic worry, perhaps combined with physical complaints like headaches, stomach upsets, or insomnia, physicians of this era are still very much talking about humors, especially that melancholic black bile we met earlier. Melancholy became a fashionable affliction for some seen sometimes as a sign of intellectual depth or artistic temperament, but for women it was often pathologized and linked more directly to physical vulnerabilities, particularly those tied to the reproductive system. The wandering womb or variations of it resurfaced alongside the humoral balance discussions. That persistent connection between female anatomy and psychological distress inherited from antiquity remains a mainstream historical fact through the Renaissance. However, this isn't just a rehashing of ancient ideas. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in anatomy and physiology. Physicians like Andreas Vesalius were dissecting bodies and creating incredibly detailed anatomical atlases, pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge beyond ancient texts. There was a growing emphasis on observation and empirical evidence, even if that evidence was still interpreted through a humoral or vaguely nervous lens. Some medical thinkers started attributing these distresses to problems with the spirits, not the spooky kind this time, but subtle fluids believed to flow through the nerves, sort of like a proto-understanding of nerve impulses or bodily energies. An imbalance or blockage of these spirits could lead to nervous complaints, agitation, and that familiar feeling of anxiousness. So you were trading in black bile for bad spiritual flow, essentially. Less messy, arguably, but still doesn't sound fun. Here's where things get truly sticky, though, particularly for women whose anxiety manifested in less typical ways or whose distress coincided with difficult life circumstances. Remember how the medieval era mixed illness with spirituality? Well, the Renaissance perfected adding danger to that mix. The era saw the horrific peak of the witch hunts. While not everyone accused of witchcraft exhibited signs of mental illness, many unfortunate women whose behavior was deemed unusual, disruptive, or simply socially unacceptable found themselves targeted. This could include women whose anxiety manifested as panic attacks, extreme social withdrawal, auditory or visual disturbances, or even just intense irritability or despair symptoms that might be misinterpreted as signs of demonic pact or influence. Consider this truly dark, quirky tidbit. One common sign of witchcraft looked a lot like panic-induced hyperventilation. Accused witches might become breathless, have fits, or be unable to speak clearly. To someone steeped in beliefs about demonic possession and witchcraft, this wasn't an anxiety attack. It was proof positive the devil was tormenting them, maybe preventing them from confessing. So your frantic feeling of being unable to breathe might get you sentenced to something terrible. Imagine living with anxiety today, having breathing difficulties, and being told, "Yep, definitely possessed. Prepare for dunking." Gives a whole new level of dread to your symptoms. Medical men might argue it was spirits or humors, but religious authorities, often with greater local power, might override them with accusations of supernatural evil. Treatments during the Renaissance thus remained a mix of the traditional and the potentially terrifying. Still, the humoral-based treatments, bleeding, purging, dietary changes designed to correct your internal balance. You might be prescribed soothing herbal remedies, hops poppy for sleep, or more bracing ones, the still popular, very bitter purgatives. Bathing was often recommended depending on the physician and your social class, either in specific mineral waters or even just warm water believed to soothe the nerves or help restore humoral balance. Rest and fresh air were also sometimes prescribed if you were wealthy enough to afford them. If your symptoms lean toward extreme distress or melancholy with delusion, their term not mind confinement, sometimes in increasingly formal institutions alongside those with severe psychiatric conditions, was a possibility. Historians still argue whether the rise in accusations of witchcraft against women during the Renaissance was primarily driven by misogyny, economic anxieties, religious fervor, or whether it was in part a societal response to behaviors potentially including anxiety-fueled ones that couldn't be easily explained or managed within their existing frameworks of medicine and morality. Were the women being persecuted genuinely suffering from mental distress? Or were they simply victims of malicious accusations in a culture primed to see the devil everywhere? It's likely a complicated mix and sadly many innocent people caught in this whirlwind. So while the Renaissance brought new knowledge about the human body and a revival of classical learning, it also kept hold of potentially dangerous beliefs. If your anxiety made you socially awkward or prone to panic, you weren't just battling internal dread. You were potentially battling accusations of something far more sinister. The idea of nerves was gaining traction, seeing conditions as disturbances of this newly considered nervous system and its spirits, but this was a slow shift. Humor's wandering wombs and the terrifying specter of demonic influence and witchcraft still loomed large in how women's psychological distress, including anxiety-like symptoms, were understood and treated. It was a time of dazzling art and dreadful fears where your internal struggles could lead you down paths far scarier than just bad humors. Try not to overthink it. Wouldn't want your humors to go wild or worse. Catch the eye of a witchfinder. Yeah, deep breaths might be wise here, modern deep breaths. Emerging from the shadows of witchcraft, accusations, and spiritual terrors, you find yourself squinting in the relative glare of the 18th century, the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Suddenly, everyone wants to be reasonable, to understand the world through observation and natural laws, not just ancient texts or divine intervention. Medicine shifts ever so slightly. Those messy balancing act humors start to feel a bit old-fashioned. Instead, attention turns to a structure everyone can agree exists well, mostly the nervous system. Doctors and philosophers begin to see a whole host of ailments as nervous disorders, and boy did women get labeled with nervous disorders. The prevailing medical term for a swirling array of physical and emotional complaints in women during this time wasn't demon possession anymore, thankfully. It was often called the vapors or the spleen, not the organ, the mood, or simply the nerves. If you were feeling anxious, experiencing palpitations, suffering from fainting spells, had unshakable fatigue, inexplicable aches, or felt overwhelmingly irritable, or low symptoms that could absolutely encompass anxiety, you likely had the vapors. This catch-all term for a female malady became a central diagnosis. That establishment of nervous complaints, and specifically the vapors as a common diagnosis for women, is a significant mainstream historical fact of the 18th century. It represented a shift from humors and external spirits to a focus, however ill-defined, on the internal workings of the nerves and body. Society also developed a strong notion of female sensibility and delicacy. Women, particularly upper-class women who weren't doing heavy manual labor, were portrayed and often believed to be physically and emotionally more fragile than men. Their nervous systems were thought to be finer-tuned, more susceptible to being overwhelmed by stimuli. Loud noises, strong emotions, even too much intellectual exertion quell horror. This meant they were seen as inherently prone to nervous complaints and the vapors. If you felt overwhelmed or anxious, well, of course you did. You were a delicate female with exquisitely sensitive nerves. It wasn't necessarily you, it was just your biologically inferior wiring causing trouble. Comforting, right? Darling, are you distressed? Faints? Ah, yes, her exquisite nerves are quite overwhelmed today. A truly delicate flower. Ugh. Treatment for the vapors varied, but since the diagnosis implied a depletion or overstimulation of the delicate nervous system, rest became a primary prescription. You might be sent to the countryside for fresh air and quiet, or confined to your room on a strict regimen of inactivity. Don't read too much. Doctors might warn, it might strain your delicate brain nerves. Travel to spa towns or places known for healthy air and gentle exercise was also common for those who could afford it. This concept of changing environment, seeking calm, and toning the nervous system through rest and regimen was key. Alongside rest came other physical treatments rooted in either fading humoral ideas or new, nerve-focused therapies. Mild bloodletting was still practiced, sometimes maybe using leeches applied to the temples to calm agitated nerves. Quirky, right? Some physicians might still try warm baths or cold plunges, hydrotherapy in its nascent form. Then there were the internal remedies. Opiate-based tinctures like laudanum, basically opium dissolved in alcohol, became shockingly common. Available over the counter in various forms, these could be used to soothe agitation, aid sleep, and dull physical discomfort associated with anxiety. Just dab a bit on your gums, problem solved. Problem not solved. Turns out opiate addiction is less ideal. Herbal teas and tonics were popular, ranging from genuinely calming herbs like valerian to highly questionable mixtures with little efficacy beyond maybe placebo. Doctors might also prescribe special diets avoiding stimulating substances like coffee or rich foods, again aiming to settle the overexcitable nerves. Imagine trying to manage chronic anxiety while your doctor tells you to stop drinking coffee, and that's it. Yeah, okay, maybe that particular advice isn't so different now, but back then they'd frame it as preserving your nervous fluid rather than managing cortisol. One particularly curious detail is the sheer prevalence of the term nervous in general conversation. To be nervous in the 18th century wasn't just about pre-test jitters. It was about possessing that exquisite, delicate constitution prone to a whole range of psychological and physical issues. Fainting couches weren't just furniture. They were necessary accessories for managing inevitable nervous spells. Women's fashion, like restrictive corsets, could easily exacerbate physical anxiety symptoms like breathlessness leading to fainting or feeling constricted, which would then be diagnosed as the vapors. Oh, her stays are a bit tight and she feels lightheaded and panicky. Clearly, it's her fragile nerves. The environment itself, both physical and social, was seen as contributing to this nervous fragility, making excessive stimulation something to be avoided. Think bustling crowds or scandalous gossip instant vapor inducers. Historians still argue whether the concept of the vapors and nervous disorders in the 18th century genuinely reflected an increase in stress-related or mood disorders in the population, or if it was primarily a cultural construct and diagnostic label that conveniently reinforced gender roles and gave upper-class women an acceptable excuse for withdrawing from demanding social duties or experiencing physical discomfort. Were they truly identifying conditions similar to modern anxiety? Or were they just pathologizing normal female responses to societal constraints and environmental factors? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Genuine suffering likely existed, but the lens through which it was viewed, labeled, and treated was heavily influenced by societal beliefs about women's supposed fragility. So if you found yourself in the 18th century grappling with that buzzing worry, the feeling of being overwhelmed, you'd probably be ushered onto a fainting couch, offered a dose of something suspiciously opiate-laden, and told that your exquisitely sensitive female nerves were simply rebelling. Your recommended therapy would likely involve a lot of rest, possibly a trip to a fashionable spa town, and definitely avoiding anything too exciting or intellectually stimulating. It's certainly a step away from chasing demons, but maybe a step into being prescribed rest because you have the audacity to read a book. Makes you feel grateful for the ability to Google stress reduction techniques without being diagnosed with delicate vapors. Unless, of course, your Wi-Fi signal is weak, that might legitimately send anyone's nerves into a tizzy, ancient or modern. As the faint smell of 18th century spa water and opium fumes fades, you step into the dense, often smoggy air of Victorian London, or maybe a quieter provincial English town spanning roughly the mid-19th century to the early 20th. This era, characterized by rapid industrialization, strict social norms, and rigid gender roles, takes that concept of the nerves we just discussed and amplifies it, polishes it, and gives it a terrifyingly broad name, hysteria. Yes, the ancient term reemerged with a vengeance, becoming a diagnostic label so prevalent and encompassing that it felt like every woman might be suffering from it to some degree. From mild irritability to paralysis, fainting spells, insomnia, emotional outbursts, sexual dysfunction, and, of course, anxiety. If you are a woman presenting with any sort of perplexing physical or emotional complaint, especially if it didn't have a clear anatomical cause visible under their limited medical tools, there was a good chance you'd be diagnosed with hysteria. That explosion of the hysteria diagnosis as a catch-all for myriad female distresses is a core, mainstream historical fact of the Victorian era. This wasn't just random bad luck. The societal context was crucial. Many middle and upper-class women lived highly circumscribed lives. Their education was often limited to domestic accomplishments. Intellectual pursuits were discouraged as overstimulating. Remember those delicate nerves, and their primary purpose was marriage and motherhood. If they weren't married, spinsterhood could bring its own anxieties. If they were married, they faced expectations, often leaving them with little agency or stimulation outside the home. The theory often went that hysteria was caused either by idle wombs, yep, still those lack of stimulation, not enough balls, not enough, well, anything interesting, or conversely too much excitement or repression of natural drives. You couldn't win, really. Too bored hysteria, to stimulated hysteria. Experiencing complicated emotions about your restrictive life must be your hysteria acting up. It became an incredibly convenient way to dismiss or pathologize female discontent. Oh, you feel stifled and miserable, have some hysteria? Charming. Given this broad and vague diagnosis, treatments were equally wide-ranging, and by today's standards, often bizarre or deeply uncomfortable. You might still encounter variations of hydrotherapy, cold showers, sitz baths, packing the patient in wet sheets, sometimes quite forceful. The idea was often to shock or tone the nervous system. Imagine being wrapped in ice-cold sheets when you're already feeling anxious and probably a bit chilly from your drafty Victorian mansion. Sounds utterly delightful. Electricity was a new and exciting and often misunderstood force, so you might also undergo galvanism, receiving mild electric shocks to purportedly stimulate or soothe nerves. Shock therapy in its early experimental days, folks. But perhaps the most infamous, and certainly one of the most controversial treatments for hysteria, especially if sexual frustration was believed to be a contributing factor, was manual pelvic massage performed by the physician. The goal purportedly was to bring the patient to a hysterical paroxysm or orgasm believed to release built-up tension or nervous energy stored in the reproductive organs, thereby relieving symptoms. Physicians reportedly found this task tedious and time-consuming, leading to the development of various mechanical devices to automate the process. Yes, this is where the slightly mythologized connection to the origins of the vibrator for medical purposes comes in. Now that's a quirky and deeply uncomfortable historical tidbit. While the historical accuracy of the direct link to the vibrator is debated, often conflated with later purposes, the use of mechanical devices and manual massage specifically to induce therapeutic paroxysms was a real and common treatment approach for hysteria among Victorian women. Just let that thought settle for a moment. Imagine feeling anxious, and someone suggests that as the cure. Then, there was the widely popular but truly dreadful rest cure developed by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell. Intended for women with severe hysteria, nervousness, and exhaustion, this involved total isolation, often for 6 to 8 weeks. No visitors, no reading, no writing, no thinking intellectually, forced overfeeding, often high-fat foods and milk, sometimes through feeding tubes and complete bed rest. The idea was to break down the woman's existing nervous energy and rebuild her under the physician's strict control, turning her back into a docile, healthier, read-compliant version of herself. It often resulted in physical weakness and psychological distress, with patients like the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was subjected to the rest cure, describing it as torturous and debilitating. She wrote the famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, as a response to her experience. Mitchell basically told her not to read or write ever again, which is pretty harsh advice for a writer struggling with depression and possibly anxiety. Historians still argue whether Victorian hysteria was a distinct medical condition, perhaps a manifestation of severe anxiety, depression, or other distress influenced by social factors, or whether it was primarily a cultural label applied to women whose physical and emotional suffering didn't fit neat diagnostic categories, and/or whose behavior deviated from expected norms. Were physicians genuinely trying to treat illness, or were they subtly or not so subtly trying to reinforce control over women's lives and bodies using medical means? It's a subject of much debate, complicated by the fact that genuine suffering was clearly involved, but the framework for understanding and addressing it was so intertwined with restrictive societal views of women. The treatments themselves reflected this ambiguity. Were they therapeutic or just punitive? Hydrotherapy could be invigorating or terrifying. Electric shocks, well, probably just uncomfortable. The manual massage seems ethically questionable and reinforces the idea of women's bodies as mechanical devices needing periodic release. And the rest cure reads like psychological torture masquerading as healing. So in the Victorian era, if you were anxious, stressed, or just generally unwell in a way that defied easy explanation, you might be diagnosed with the ubiquitous hysteria and subjected to therapies that ranged from restrictive isolation to frankly bizarre manual procedures, all because your reproductive organs and overtaxed delicate nerves just couldn't seem to cope with, well, apparently being a woman in the Victorian era. Good times. Maybe you should just try not having symptoms simple. Okay, not simple at all. Probably stress-inducing just thinking about it. Leaving behind the restrictive stays, manual procedures, and mandatory milk diets of the Victorians, you step into the rapidly changing landscape of the early 20th century. The carriages are starting to share the streets with automobiles. Women are beginning to demand the right to vote, and whispers are circulating about radical new ideas coming from Vienna. Instead of seeing anxiety, depression, or the lingering phantom of hysteria purely as problems with runaway reproductive organs, deficient nerve spirits, or excess black bile, a new framework starts to emerge, focusing not on the body's fluids or physical structures, but on the inner workings of the mind. The figure most associated with this shift is Sigmund Freud. Sitting patiently on a couch, you might finally feel heard as Freud or one of his followers listened to you free associate, saying whatever popped into your head, no matter how random or silly it seemed. Freud proposed that many psychological problems, including anxiety, weren't just caused by physical maladies or moral weakness, but by unconscious conflicts and repressed emotions, often stemming from early childhood experiences. Those uncomfortable thoughts, forbidden desires, or traumatic memories weren't gone. They were just pushed out of conscious awareness, bubbling up later in the form of symptoms. Irrational fears, physical complaints, and that pervasive feeling of dread. This focus on the unconscious and internal psychological conflict as the root cause of distress was a seismic shift and constitutes a mainstream historical fact of this era's approach to psychological issues. Hysteria, as a catch-all medical term tied solely to women's biology, began its long, slow fade. It was being replaced, or at least challenged, by a psychological understanding seeing these as neuroses rooted in mental life, not just physiological malfunction. So your anxiety wasn't your womb doing cartwheels or your nerves short-circuiting. According to Freud, it might be your Oedipal complex gone sideways, unresolved trauma from being breastfed or not breastfed enough, or your superego being really, really mean to your ID. Yes, there were ID, ego, and superego diagrams involved. Look them up if you dare. They feel like psychological furniture blueprints. The cure wasn't a cold shower or forced rest, it was analysis. Uncovering the buried pain, bringing the unconscious to light, understanding why you felt the way you felt by painstakingly reconstructing your psychological history. The therapy room, often featuring that iconic couch, became a sanctuary or a confessional box, depending on your perspective, where you could unspool the narrative of your life to a usually male authority figure. The actual process was extensive. You might have several sessions a week, sometimes for years. The cost prohibitive for all but the wealthy elite. This talking cure, as it was famously nicknamed, wasn't a quick fix. It was a deep dive, sometimes feeling less like a dive and more like being dragged through emotional quicksand with occasional moments of confusing insight. You'd talk about everything. Your dreams, lots of interpretation there. Hopefully you weren't dreaming about trains or cigars. Freud had some very specific ideas about those. Your relationship with your parents, your fears, your fantasies. The analyst would listen, offering interpretations based on Freudian theory, helping you see how past events and unconscious drives were influencing your present distress. It sounds intense because, well, it was. Forget leeching. Now you were just expected to bleed out your psyche bit by bit, week after week, for a substantial fee. Talk about commitment issues in both senses. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. The success of psychoanalysis often hinged on the development of transference, where the patient unconsciously projected feelings from significant past relationships, especially parents, onto the analyst. This could range from intense affection to furious resentment. It was considered a crucial part of the therapeutic process to work through these transferred feelings with the analyst. So, if you suddenly felt irrationally angry at the person listening patiently to your deepest secrets, that was paradoxically a good sign. Progress. It's like your therapy was going so well it made you irrationally furious. Makes sense, right? Totally normal to develop complex parental relationship dynamics with the guy you pay to analyze your dreams. This talk therapy approach marked a significant departure. It finally moved psychological distress squarely into the realm of psychology and psychiatry, away from purely anatomical explanations by wandering womb. Though hysteria took a while to fully vanish, and overtly moral, spiritual judgments, sorry demons, maybe try a different dimension. Anxiety was no longer just something your body did when its humors were off. It was something your mind produced because of internal conflicts. This offered a new sense of understanding, perhaps even hope for people who had been told they were delicate, malingering, or cursed. Your anxiety was real. It just needed sophisticated psychological detective work to solve. However, psychoanalysis wasn't universally accepted or effective for everyone, especially for debilitating conditions beyond generalized anxiety or distress. Its heavy reliance on interpretation and long duration drew criticism. The focus on sexual drives, hello Oedipus, and early childhood felt limiting to some. While it birthed the entire field of psychotherapy and counseling, leading to many other schools of talk therapy, its direct practice remained largely an elite affair. Could someone experiencing crippling panic attacks or deep existential anxiety find relief recounting childhood potty training incidents for years? Sometimes yes, sometimes less so. Other forms of therapy began to branch off, looking for faster, more targeted ways to alleviate suffering. But Freud opened the door to talking about mental problems as psychological entities with psychological roots, and that door never truly closed. Historians still argue whether Freudian psychoanalysis, while revolutionary in its concepts, was genuinely effective in treating the broad spectrum of psychological distress it aimed to address, especially anxiety. Was it the groundbreaking therapeutic approach he claimed, or did it merely provide a new culturally specific narrative for understanding suffering for a certain class of people while being inaccessible and arguably ineffective for others? Did the talking cure, heal, or just help the affluent analyze their discomfort in exquisite, prolonged detail? It's a fascinating debate, complicated by the evolution of psychoanalysis itself and the difficulty of proving efficacy across centuries and cultures. But one thing is clear: after Freud, dealing with that internal buzzing dread was firmly on the psychological agenda, requiring introspective journeys rather than merely outward corrections of the body or environment. You might still feel anxious, but at least now someone would listen to you explain why, even if their explanation involved confusing concepts like castration anxiety. Silver linings, maybe. Okay, so the early 20th century gives us the psychological couch, a place to untangle your unconscious knots, but it was pricey and took forever. What happens when a society that values efficiency and believes strongly in scientific progress needs a quicker fix? Well, the mid-20th century rolls around, bringing with it new understandings of brain chemistry, albeit still very primitive compared to now, and crucially, drugs. Chemical compounds developed in labs that promised to soothe the nerves, dampen distress, and generally take the edge off that pesky anxiety. Enter the age of pharmaceuticals as a major tool for managing psychological symptoms, including anxiety, particularly prevalent from the 1950s onwards. Early examples included drugs like Miltown meprobamate, and later the first benzodiazepines like Librium chlordiazepoxide and Valium diazepam. These weren't just sedatives, they were marketed specifically as tranquilizers, designed to reduce anxiety and tension without causing total sedation like barbiturates. This wasn't a niche approach. Doctors started prescribing these powerful pills on a massive scale for conditions once vaguely labeled as nerves or the vestiges of hysteria. For women experiencing anxiety, often under pressure from domestic duties or limited life choices, these pills became incredibly common prescriptions. That widespread introduction and popularization of tranquilizer drugs as a primary treatment for anxiety and related nervous conditions heavily directed at women is a major mainstream historical fact of the mid-century. It offered a compelling alternative to years on a psychoanalyst's couch or more extreme historical cures. Pop a pill, maybe feel better fast. Simple spoiler. It wasn't always simple, and addiction quickly became a problem. These new drugs fit neatly into a society that was often uncomfortable with deep psychological exploration, and yet saw many women struggling with roles that felt increasingly confined despite apparent societal progress. Marketing campaigns for these tranquilizers often explicitly targeted housewives, depicting them overwhelmed by vacuum cleaners or fussy children, saved by a tiny pill that would allow them to cope with the demands of domestic life with a smile. It perpetuated a narrative where women's distress, including anxiety, was something to be chemically managed so they could return to their expected roles, rather than potentially explore the underlying social or personal factors causing that distress. Your feeling of being trapped or anxious wasn't necessarily a valid response to your circumstances. It was a chemical imbalance needing a pill. Just calm down, darling, here's a Valium. Nice. Simultaneously, for more severe or chronic cases, especially if drug treatment wasn't enough, or the person was seen as unable to function outside structured care, psychiatric hospitals and asylums remained a significant part of the landscape. Conditions inherited from the past, often now reframed under diagnostic categories like schizophrenia, Severe depression or chronic neurosis, which could include what we'd call severe persistent anxiety, led to institutionalization. While some institutions provided therapeutic environments, many were overcrowded, understaffed, and offered little more than custodial care. Treatment within these institutions for female anxiety and related conditions could range from still questionable versions of hydrotherapy and early and sometimes experimental psychotropic drugs to lobotomy in severe rare cases and more structured but often mundane therapies like occupational therapy, like basket weaving or simple crafts designed to provide distraction and a semblance of normalcy. Here's a quirky tidbit reflecting the complex treatments available even within institutional settings in the mid-20th century. Psychoanalysis coexisted with drug therapy and other physical treatments. While a prominent private psychiatrist might primarily use the couch, a doctor in a state asylum might be managing patients primarily with newly available antipsychotics or tranquilizers, while also potentially offering group therapy sessions that drew on Freudian or Jungian concepts and perhaps even employing electroshock therapy (ECT) for severe cases unresponsive to other methods. Imagine navigating that therapeutic buffet. So today we have Valium followed by basket weaving, topped off with maybe a little light analysis or electroshock depending on how chatty you're feeling, which sounds good for your persistent worrying. Quite the menu. The rise of effective or perceived effective medications and growing awareness and criticism of the often poor conditions in large state institutions began to fuel a movement towards deinstitutionalization from the mid-20th century onwards. The idea was that people could be better cared for in their communities with outpatient therapy and medication rather than being warehoused far from home. This shift had complex consequences. For some, it meant finally escaping restrictive or abusive environments and having a chance at community integration. For others, particularly if adequate community resources weren't available, it led to homelessness, lack of consistent care, and further marginalization. Historians still argue whether the mid-20th century reliance on tranquilizers was primarily a medical advancement offering genuine relief from suffering, or whether it represented a form of social control masking women's legitimate distress with chemical placidity to maintain traditional roles and societal expectations. Did these pills genuinely improve women's lives by reducing debilitating anxiety? Or did they suppress their agency and silence their symptoms without addressing root causes? The widespread addiction to many of these early drugs like Valium later highlighted their significant downsides and added another layer of suffering. And while deinstitutionalization aimed for progress, historians debate its success and consequences, particularly for vulnerable populations, including women with complex mental health needs who were previously institutionalized. So if you found yourself anxious in the mid-20th century navigating a rapidly changing world, your options had expanded from just endless talking. You were now very likely to be offered a pill, a chemical promise of calm, delivered in a small tablet. If your anxiety was severe or intertwined with other significant mental health issues, you might still face the prospect of institutional care with treatments ranging from outdated physical methods to new drugs group therapy or basic occupational tasks. The debate had shifted from humors and demons to chemicals and couches, institutions and communities, grappling with how to manage the mind's turmoil in ways that were scientific, effective, and ideally humane. And yes, those calm the housewife ads are still pretty funny until you realize the underlying message about women's stress being just a temporary chemical blip, not a potentially valid reaction to, well, reality. Progress. As the century matures, rolling through the turbulent 60s, the groovy 70s, and the more pragmatic 80s and 90s, the conversations around psychological distress start to shift again. The heavy reliance on broad-spectrum tranquilizers begins to draw concern due to their addictive potential and side effects. Remember those widely prescribed pills promising easy calm? And while talk therapy remained important, lengthy, expensive psychoanalysis felt less and less accessible or suitable for the pressures of modern life. Society still seeing a significant amount of what would previously have been labeled nerves or milder neuroses in women, particularly as societal roles slowly, complexly began to change, demanded solutions that felt more actionable, more scientific, and potentially more efficient. Out of this demand, two major approaches gain widespread prominence, becoming defining features of late 20th century mental health care for conditions including anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), and a new class of psychiatric medications called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. Instead of spending years digging for buried childhood trauma psychoanalysis, CBT invites you to look at your current thoughts and behaviors. The core idea: your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected. Change one, you can influence the others. Feeling anxious. Let's identify those looping anxious thoughts, challenge whether they're actually true or helpful, and practice behaviors like facing feared situations gradually that contradict your anxiety response. It's practical, often time-limited weeks or months, not years, and focuses on specific skills you can learn to manage your distress in the here and now. This emergence and widespread adoption of CBT as a structured evidence-based talking therapy was a significant mainstream historical fact of this era. It offered a very different way of addressing anxiety than laying silently on a couch talking about your mother or simply being tranquilized into submission. So, instead of discussing my dream about a giant snake symbolizing something, maybe I just practice breathing when I feel panicky about crowds. Novel. At the same time, pharmaceutical research delivered a different kind of pill. Moving away from general sedatives, or just dampening the entire nervous system, SSRIs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil came onto the scene in the late 80s and early 90s. The theory was that anxiety and depression were linked at least in part to imbalances or dysregulation of certain neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly serotonin. These drugs aim to increase the availability of serotonin in specific areas of the brain, helping to regulate mood and reduce symptoms. They weren't designed to be sedating, and were seen as having less addictive potential than the old benzodiazepines, making them a seemingly safer option for longer-term use. That introduction and subsequent massive popularization of SSRIs became the other cornerstone treatment of this period, offering a chemical approach specifically targeted at the suspected underlying neurochemical pathways involved in mood and anxiety disorders. So now, instead of opium tinctures, extensive bleeding rest cures, or generalized tranquilizers, a woman presenting with significant anxiety was much more likely to be offered either a course of CBT, often working through manuals or structured exercises focusing on things like challenging distorted thinking patterns, catastrophizing all-or-nothing thinking, or practicing relaxation techniques and exposure therapy, or a prescription for an SSRI. Sometimes both were recommended as complementary approaches. This felt like a move towards precision, using targeted therapies and medications rather than blunt tools, or overly broad, sometimes misogynistic diagnoses. Your racing heart might not be your womb yearning for release, but perhaps the physical manifestation of thought patterns spiraling out of control, addressable by changing how you process information. Maybe aided by nudging those serotonin levels. Here's a quirky tidbit related to this diagnostic and therapeutic shift. The classification of mental disorders itself underwent a major transformation just before the full explosion of CBT and SSRIs. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-3 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition. This manual moved away from the psychoanalytic assumptions of earlier editions toward more symptom-based criteria you could checklist. Crucially, it created specific, clearly defined categories for different types of anxiety disorders that we still use today. Panic disorder, social phobia, now social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, later moved post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, newly added. This meant you weren't just vaguely nervous or suffering from neurosis, you had this specific kind of anxiety. This seemingly clinical bureaucratic change had huge downstream effects, driving research-shaping training for therapists, allowing for targeted CBT protocols for specific disorders, and influencing which medications were studied and prescribed for which condition. It made diagnosing and therefore treating anxiety feel much more precise and scientific. Okay, based on these 5 out of 8 symptoms you've had for 6 months, you officially have GAD. Good news, there's a specific protocol for that. And potentially a specific pill. The late 20th century brought a feeling of empowerment to many dealing with anxiety. Here were tools you could understand. Techniques you could learn, CBT homework, or medications working on tangible brain chemistry, well, sort of tangible. It shifted the narrative for many women from being inherently flawed or delicate vapors hysteria, or needing endless internal excavation psychoanalysis, to having a condition with recognizable symptoms and treatable pathways. Support groups focusing on specific anxiety disorders began to form, and anxiety became a topic discussed with less shame, more understanding often using the terms defined by that influential DSM. However, it wasn't a perfect picture. CBT, while evidence-based, sometimes felt too rigid or focused on symptoms without fully acknowledging deeper life contexts or trauma. And while SSRIs were seen as safer, they still had side effects, didn't work for everyone, and sparked a debate about the medicalization of normal emotional states. Were we using pills to cure genuine suffering or just to make people conform to a non-anxious norm in an increasingly stressful world? Were mild worries now being labeled and treated as disorders? Historians still argue whether the rise of DSM-based diagnosis, CBT and SSRIs, truly led to a fundamental improvement in addressing the underlying causes of women's anxiety, or if it primarily offered better symptom management within the existing societal structures that contribute to stress. Did women finally receive effective care tailored to their specific issues? Or were they steered towards short-term fixes? Pills and protocolized therapy that left broader societal and personal factors contributing to their distress unexamined? It's a debate about empowerment versus medicalization, precision versus context, and whether late 20th century science provided true solutions or just better tools to manage symptoms without rocking the boat too much. At least the treatment involved slightly less questionable massages or wrapping you in cold, wet sheets. Small victories, folks. Progress isn't always linear or entirely comfortable, but at least the homework felt less dangerous than ancient medicinal drinks. So while the bright lights of science started promising structured talk therapy and targeted pills for your worries in the later 20th century, it's worth remembering that for the vast majority of history, and even alongside the official medicine we've discussed, people, especially women, relied on all sorts of other approaches. We're talking about folk medicine, family remedies, charms, incantations and concoctions whispered about in villages and kitchen corners, treatments far stranger and less regulated than anything happening in the formal doctor's chambers. Forget controlled clinical trials. This was trial and error tradition, and a heavy dose of superstition, often blurring the lines between health luck and protection from unseen forces. That widespread use of folk remedies and non-professional healing practices as a parallel system to formal medicine is a major, albeit often less documented, historical fact. Formal medical history tends to focus on the documented practices of learned physicians, but the vast majority of people accessed healing in very different ways throughout most of history, often relying on traditional healers or self-treating with local knowledge and bizarre practices. Think back to those medieval anxieties about demons and sin, or the Renaissance fear of witchcraft blending with melancholy. If you didn't have access to a learned physician, which most people didn't or couldn't afford a psychoanalyst's couch, impossible before the 20th century, anyway, and still mostly inaccessible, what did you do with that churning fear? You turned to what was available: the local wise woman, a family remedy passed down, or common superstitions given therapeutic twists. And oh, some of these treatments were wild. Remember the wandering womb from ancient Egypt? Some cultures much later still held residual beliefs that bodily ailments, including what looked like anxiety, could be related to issues in the reproductive system, leading to equally bizarre local fixes. You might find recommendations in old herbals or folklore for carrying specific objects near your body part, believed to be the problem, or rubbing particular poultices on areas associated with it. It wasn't quite enticing organs with smells, but maybe more like politely demanding they behave via external pressure or symbolic touch. A genuinely quirky and rather creepy tidbit across various historical periods and cultures, there are scattered accounts of women being told to wear amulets containing ingredients like menstrual blood animal organs, or ground bone near the abdomen as a way to regulate or soothe supposed uterine-linked nervous complaints. The idea was likely tied to sympathetic magic, using a bodily substance to influence that same part of the body, but thinking about the feel of that amulet and the smell, yeah, probably didn't calm the nerves as much as induce nausea. You might worry about your anxiety, but you'd probably also be intensely worried about getting an infection from wearing what amounts to rotten animal parts near your stomach. Anxiety upgrade. Other non-mainstream remedies leaned heavily on charms rituals and invocations, especially where illness was linked to spiritual or malicious forces. If your anxiety felt like a weight on your chest, maybe you recited a specific prayer to ward off the nightmare, a sort of physical entity believed to sit on sleepers and cause distress like historical sleep paralysis with added demons. Perfect. If you were suddenly gripped by irrational fears, you might carry a sachet filled with herbs believed to have protective qualities against envy or bad luck, or maybe say a specific blessing over a glass of water before drinking it to purify it from unseen harmful influences. This overlaps a bit with religion, but functions more on a folk level. These weren't usually official church rites, but community-held practices blending piety with practical magic. It's the historical equivalent of knocking on wood mixed with medical treatment. Feeling anxious about leaving the house? Try deep breaths and grounding techniques. Or wear a sock full of pebbles while singing off-key Gregorian chants. Your pick, definitely recommend the deep breaths. Sometimes the ingredients for these home cures were just baffling. Think about trying to soothe nervous tension with potions containing boiled mice pigeon dung. Again with the dung, medieval doctors must have been really into excretions as medicine or mixtures requiring ingredients gathered under a specific phase of the moon. One particularly delightful example was using potions made from something called moss from a dead man's skull, or even fragments of the skull itself, part of what's broadly called medicinal cannibalism, an unsettling and surprisingly widespread practice in historical Europe. The belief was that absorbing something from a powerful entity, even a deceased one, could transfer qualities like resilience or ward off evil. Trying to quell your anxiety by consuming parts of a corpse? Yeah, modern therapy feels incredibly gentle by comparison. The logic behind these cures could be similia similibus, like cures like sort of homeopathy in a twisted sense where something unpleasant or chaotic is used to fight an unpleasant or chaotic state like anxiety. Or sympathetic magic, where a characteristic of the ingredient was transferred to the patient. Drink a tonic made from a brave animal, gain courage. Drink something foul, expel the foulness causing your distress. It all sounds wonderfully reasoned if you squint through about 500 years of outdated physiology and magical thinking. Historians still argue whether many documented folk remedies and home cures, particularly those using obscure or unpleasant ingredients, actually offered any therapeutic benefit beyond potentially a placebo effect driven by belief, or whether they often exacerbated suffering, posed genuine health risks due to toxicity or infection, and were more about managing fear and adhering to cultural practices than genuinely healing. Were these methods effective tools of coping for people with limited access to formal medicine, or were they simply products of superstition and desperation that sometimes bordered on harm? It's a complex debate, complicated by the fact that some traditional herbal remedies did contain active compounds, valerian as mentioned before, or various sedative plants that might have offered some small measure of symptomatic relief, getting mixed in with truly useless or dangerous ingredients. So, nestled alongside the rise of psychodynamic therapy and the introduction of chemical tranquilizers in the relatively recent past, and certainly during the many centuries dominated by humors and vapors and spirits, there existed a vast, messy, often terrifying world of alternative anxiety treatments. These weren't prescribed by doctors in suits. They were brewed in cottages passed down through generations, filled with ingredients that would make you gag and beliefs that might make your blood run cold. If modern self-help gurus suggest journaling and meditation for your stress, historical equivalents might have recommended wearing a piece of owl feather for protection or drinking a tea infused with ground gemstones. Makes choosing a brand of chamomile tea feel decidedly less adventurous but infinitely safer. So, yeah, remember when you thought CBT homework was tough? Try making a poultice out of cemetery dirt and whispering an incantation for inner peace. Suddenly, deep breathing feels like a luxury spa retreat. You've traversed the centuries, dodging wandering wombs, sniffing questionable amulets surviving rest cures, enduring questionable massages, and even braving the deep dive into the unconscious. And now, you find yourself right here in the busy, bright, sometimes overwhelmingly stimulating modern world. The late 20th century handed us diagnostic categories, specific talking therapies, and targeted pills. But the conversation around anxiety, particularly for women, didn't stop there. The early 21st century brought further refinement. Diagnosis continued to be guided by successive editions of that symptom-based checklist, the DSM, the DSM-4, and now the DSM-5. This process, while making diagnosis more uniform, also expanded the boundaries of what was considered an anxiety disorder, leading to both better identification of suffering and concerns about medicalizing normal worries. researchers learned more about the intricate neurobiological pathways involved in anxiety, deepening the understanding of the role of neurotransmitters beyond just serotonin. They began to explore genetic predispositions, the impact of early life stress on brain development, and the complex interplay between mind and body in creating the anxiety response. That continued more granular scientific investigation into the biological and psychological mechanisms of anxiety disorders, leading to updated diagnostic classifications and treatment guidelines, is a core mainstream historical fact shaping where we are today. We're not just guessing at humors or nervous spirits. We're mapping neural circuits, understanding the amygdala's role in fear, and identifying genetic markers that might increase vulnerability. It feels a bit like we've finally exchanged that magnifying glass for an MRI scanner and a supercomputer. Talking therapies evolved too. CBT remains incredibly influential, but newer approaches have gained ground. You might encounter acceptance and commitment therapy ACT, which encourages you to accept difficult thoughts and feelings rather than fighting them while committing to actions aligned with your values. Or mindfulness-based therapies rooted in ancient meditative practices, but adapted for clinical use, focusing on increasing present moment awareness without judgment. Exposure and response prevention. ERP, a specific type of CBT for OCD and panic, where you gradually and intentionally expose yourself to feared situations or thoughts while preventing your usual anxious coping response, is now considered a gold standard. These therapies feel for many less like curing an illness and more like learning to navigate your internal landscape and live a fulfilling life despite moments of anxiety. Remember those complicated charts of ID, ego, and superego from the Freudian era? Modern therapy often provides more practical toolkits. Okay, my fear is a fuzzy monster under the bed. I can't kill it, but maybe I can teach it to knit, or at least not feed it my endless supply of what-ifs. Pharmacology kept pace. Beyond SSRIs, doctors now prescribe SNRIs, serotonin, norepinephrine, reuptake, inhibitors, beta blockers for performance anxiety, and occasionally still use benzodiazepines for short-term severe episodes, but with much greater caution due to addiction risk. There's also research into glutamate system modulators, cannabinoid compounds, complicated debate there, and other novel targets based on our growing understanding of brain chemistry. The pharmaceutical options for managing anxiety symptoms feel incredibly diverse, compared to just a century ago, ranging from medications for chronic worry to those specifically for panic attacks or social phobia. Culturally, the biggest shift might be this: people are actually talking about anxiety. You see celebrities openly discussing their panic attacks, hear friends mentioning therapy, scroll past articles offering coping tips. While stigma certainly hasn't vanished, it's significantly lessened compared to the days when anxiety was dismissed as vapors or a sign of delicate nerves that required you to just lay down quietly. However, this openness also leads to a slightly paradoxical modern challenge. With anxiety so widely recognized and discussed, and with accessible checklists like those in the DSM, there's a debate about whether the definition of anxiety disorder has become too broad. Here's a quirky thought. Sometimes it feels like navigating modern life inherently produces anxiety. Constant notifications, comparing ourselves to filtered online realities, a 24/7 news cycle, the feeling of needing to optimize every moment. Maybe feeling anxious is in some instances less a disorder and more a completely rational response to an increasingly irrational, fast-paced, always-on world. Historians still argue whether the significant rise in diagnosed anxiety disorders in recent decades reflects a genuine increase in suffering driven perhaps by modern societal pressures and neurochemical changes, or if it's primarily a product of increased awareness, reduced stigma, and changes in diagnostic practices that have pathologized normal human worry or responses to stressful environments. Are we getting more anxious or just better at labeling it as a medical problem? And are our treatments curing distress or simply medicating the completely understandable discomfort of existing in 2024? It's complicated. Is the dizzying array of therapy techniques and medications proof of progress, or just evidence of how much we're struggling to keep up? Little bit of column A, little bit of column B, maybe. Looking ahead, the future of treating anxiety, especially with potential differences based on gender or individual presentation, looks set to get even more personalized and technological. We might see treatments based on your specific genetic profile, neurofeedback approaches, where you learn to directly modulate your brain activity. Virtual reality therapy for things like phobias facing that crowded square you dread. but in VR or widespread access to care via telehealth platforms, reducing geographical barriers. There are research avenues exploring everything from microdosing certain substances to novel brain stimulation techniques. The sheer complexity of the human brain means we're constantly discovering new potential targets and mechanisms. You might eventually have a tailor-made treatment plan based on your unique brain signature rather than being lumped into a broad diagnostic category, getting a generic pill or protocol. Compared to coaxing your wandering womb back into place with incense or undergoing electrically induced paroxysms, navigating your modern anxiety offers an unprecedented array of options, discussions, and scientific understanding. We've moved from humoral imbalances to complex neural networks, from spiritual tormentors to psychological thought patterns. The journey hasn't been linear, and it hasn't been kind to everyone throughout history, especially women whose distress was often misunderstood, dismissed, or used against them. But today, you have resources, language, and mostly safer, more rational tools. It's still a challenge, this internal buzzing fear, but at least you're unlikely to be prescribed owl feathers or accused of witchcraft for feeling it. Just the endless scrolling on mental health social media, which honestly might bring its own form of anxiety. Progress. It's a process, apparently. Okay. The history lesson portion is complete. Your journey through centuries of trying to figure out what's going on when the world and your own mind feels a little too much is nearing its end for tonight. It's been a long wander through ancient fears, medieval prayers, vaporous fainting spells, Victorian restraints, psychoanalytic couches, and finally into the era of mindful apps and neuroscience. As the historical figures and practices fade back into the mist, leaving behind the echoes of wandering wombs and questionable poultices, take a slow breath. Feel yourself grounded right here, right now, safe in your own space. The light might feel softer now, the sounds of the outside world distant and muffled. Let any lingering thoughts about burnt animal hides or forced feeding drift away like dandelion fluff on a gentle breeze. Allow the stories to dissolve into the quiet comfort surrounding you. You don't have to figure out complex humors or fight ancient demons tonight. Just listen to the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Slow, steady, a quiet reminder of where you are, who you are, feeling the comforting weight of the blankets. Maybe the soft hum of that fan you turned on. Every breath in, peaceful. Every breath out, letting go. Just easing gently now into rest, allowing the stillness to settle in your body and your mind. You are safe. You are here. And it is time to simply be, falling softly now into sleep.